Hello and welcome to this episode of Thermonuclear Takes from Physical Attraction. Fans of the show will know already, this is the version of the show where we talk about things that have been in the news, things that aren't really normally in our wheelhouse. We talk about topical things, and this particular episode is one that has been brewing for quite a while. It is finally the cryptocurrency rant. Now, we're going to be talking about cryptocurrencies, mostly about Bitcoin. I haven't actually kept my opinions on this particularly secret, and I've felt the same way for quite a while. For that reason, a lot of what I have to say won't be news to people who have read things that I've tweeted or articles that I've written. In fact, I published an article way back in 2018 on Singularity Hub about the insane energy consumption of Bitcoin, which has a lot of the general opinion about cryptocurrencies in there, and it's not really changed since, but I've generally refrained from talking about it on the show for a simple reason. I know it's controversial, I know that I'm very opinionated on this topic, and there are two things that you can't say anything negative about on the internet without people coming at you, which is Elon Musk and Bitcoin. But then Musk went and bought a load of Bitcoin and people started noticing once again that it's consuming a ridiculous amount of electricity, and it just seems like every time the price of this thing spikes, the discussion and the same debates that we had 3 or 4 years ago are renewed all over again. And given my pretty firm stance on this, it just felt it was inevitable that eventually I would have to do some sort of ranty episode on it, just get it all out of my system and then not have to think about it again. And this is the definitive point that I will make about it. And I wondered if maybe now would be the time. And then I got an email from a listener who, out of the blue, told me they were a huge cryptocurrency enthusiast. Not just in terms of the price, but in terms of this sort of underlying philosophy and how it might change society. And they wanted to know what I thought about these ideas. And I emailed back saying that I'd been reluctant to talk about it because my opinion is very negative and I was concerned it might annoy a lot of people or come off as ranty or angry, when in many ways I'm not that concerned about this. But to my emailer's credit, he said this. He said, "Yes, I would be very happy to hear that type of content. In my opinion, your shows are not really aimed at people who are married to their worldviews, but rather to people who are open to see the nuances and other perspectives on subjects they thought they knew. This is exactly why I sent this email in the first place. I had a feeling you're not a crypto enthusiast, but I don't really know why. Letting your audience know why, in a fact-based approach, could really shed some light on some shortcomings that people like me aren't really seeing." So this was it, red rag to a bull. I now have the blessing of a Bitcoin fan to finally unleash the rant that has been building for so long. And hopefully, if you're listening and you are in that position of being in favour of cryptocurrencies or blockchain or Bitcoin, and you're getting more and more wound up that this guy is yelling about them and wildly missing the mark, you won't get too steamy, and you'll follow his lead and send me some emails, send me some messages via the contact form on the website, explaining why I'm wrong, and we can have a good conversation and dialogue and discussion about it that actually goes into detail. Seriously. Because if people have good counterpoints to the arguments I'm making, I'd love to hear them, because most of what you get online is just misinformation, memes, stuff that's easily debunked. The level of discourse around this is so diabolical that it's so difficult to actually have a proper informed discussion about what's going on, that you despair talking about it to most people, because in many cases, I guess, we're all entrenched, we've made up our minds. I'm it's an area where I'm pretty convinced that I'm right. So perhaps with some of these things, maybe it comes down to a fundamental difference of worldview, and that might be political in nature, so there's not much I can do about that, because people will inevitably come at political issues from different angles, But unfortunately, paying attention to this thing for the last 4 or 5 years, I've come to some very negative conclusions about cryptocurrencies and what they and their valuations really suggest about society. And I'm pretty strident in my point of view. I do think it's justified. So all of this acts as a warning. I've told you what you're going to get over the next hour or so. If you don't want to hear a lengthy discussion, really a rant about politics, cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and blockchain, and I really don't blame you if you don't want to hear that, but if you don't want to hear it, turn off now. Because that is what you're going to get here. Don't say I didn't warn you. Okay, without further ado then, I'll unleash the rant. Fundamentally, the whole discourse around blockchain and its advocates has been poisoned by a lot of people who want to use Bitcoin as a speculative investment vehicle. But to do that, they have to deny that it's a speculative investment vehicle, and they have to pretend that what they're saying makes some sort of sense and that the Bitcoin itself has a useful use case even when it doesn't. And unfortunately, a lot of these people benefit when the price of this thing spikes, so they want to keep pumping up the technology, even if their rationale is shaky. And so there's a lot of people who aren't really arguing in good faith here. They're just sort of hoping that their actions and their argument and their discussion of Bitcoin will boost its price. But regardless of that, even though a lot of these arguments aren't really being advanced in good faith, I think it's worth diving into how this actually works and functions, and whether we can debunk these arguments relatively easily. So, the purpose of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, it's essentially sold to us as a means of payment and conducting transactions that doesn't require a third party to mediate between the people who are exchanging the money. So you don't need to rely on a bank to hold your money for you and to process transactions for you. You don't need to have Visa, you don't need PayPal, you don't need any of that. And you don't need anyone managing the big ledger of who has what and who has transacted with whom and all this sort of thing. Instead, all transactions are secured on one big ledger. And altering that ledger requires huge amounts of computational work. And this is done by design. You have proof of work, which involves cracking an algorithm, essentially just solving a mathematical puzzle, really. The SHA-256 algorithm is sort of factoring primes and similar problems like that. So it's solving a complicated mathematical puzzle. Computers, computational energy, central processing units, graphical processing units, these powerful computers are set to cracking these mathematical problems. And this provides proof that they have worked, and when they prove that they're working, they are essentially recording the transactions and storing the transactions that are on this ledger. But it's made very, very difficult to do, and it's made computationally intensive, so that any one person can't come in and alter the ledger by themselves. You don't need a central authority that's keeping the ledger going, because you have this distributed network who are maintaining the ledger between them, and thereby they are the ones who are processing the transactions in effect. But the distributed network itself, no one person in the distributed network who you don't trust can come in and take over the network and take over the blockchain entirely and change what's on the ledger, because the proof of work required to do so would just be too much. And in exchange for doing all of this computational work, which is kind of defending this blockchain, this ledger, from people who want to access it, they are rewarded in units of this currency. And that's what Bitcoin mining is. It is doing all of this work that secures this big ledger of all the transactions that Bitcoins have been used for. And that is in essence how most cryptocurrencies work. There are new methods that are coming out, different ways of securing blockchains. But the fundamental idea is that you do away with the central authority that processes payments and that keeps track of things on a ledger, and you replace it with a big distributed system where lots of different people with lots of different computers are forced to undertake this complex algorithm, cracking various mathematical puzzles to secure the ledger and replace the central authority who you would trust to process transactions beforehand. And so the key advantage of this, according to the evangelists, is that you don't need a central guarantor of these transactions to do the payment processing and security, and therefore, you don't have access to everyone's identity and all this sort of thing as a bank might. Now, this computational work that's done with these CPUs and GPUs churning through calculations. One thing about it is we talked about them solving this mathematical puzzle. Well, this mathematical puzzle is not of use to anyone. It is useless by design. And this is a problem because it is now using energy equivalent to a small country. But it is useless by design. It's essentially only done to make it hard for an external party to hack into the ledger of transactions and alter it without an enormous amount of computing power, which no one individual could do. Now, there have been various cryptocurrencies proposed where this proof of work could be something useful, where, for example, you could be simulating climate change or the protein folding problem or doing some other number crunching that someone would find useful. There are less successful cryptocurrencies that actually attempt to do this, that actually have proof of work that is more useful than just solving this mathematical puzzle that no one really wants the answer to. But the original designers of Bitcoin actually said, no, we can't have that. It has to be cracking this cryptographic algorithm, this SHA-256 hash. And the reason they did this was they were worried that if mining Bitcoins did useful computational work, the value of Bitcoin might somehow be coupled to the value that society put on that work. So, for example, imagine if what it was doing was, simulating protein folding. If there was a huge demand for simulating protein folding, more people might put their computers to work at doing that and mining Bitcoin at the same time, and then maybe the demand for Bitcoin would fall, or the supply would increase too much because there'd be too many miners who were doing it for other things, or that the price of the Bitcoins would be related inversely, I guess, to the amount that people would be willing to pay you to do this useful kind of computational work. And they didn't want that. They wanted the price to be a sort of freely floating thing, so it was intentionally and perversely set up, I think, such that all of this work, which is now an incredibly substantial volume of energy that's being used, would be useless by design. And I think in the age of climate change, a system that burns through huge amounts of electricity and processing power and computer hardware and so on to do work that is useless by design is not a great thing. And the fact is, you really don't get much in exchange for what you're doing. So before we even get into the fact that this has become this speculative instrument that is, I think quite damaging to society at large, the fundamental concept here has flaws in it. Now, typically, when you bring this up, Bitcoin defenders will say one of a few things. So I'll sort them by order from most to least annoying. I've seen them say, what about the energy that banks use? This to me is what I would simply describe as mouth words. Mouth words is a phrase I've tried to coin, it's never going to catch on. But it essentially refers to a stock response that people give in reply to a particular question or topic. It's classic whataboutism, but the point of mouth words is not that people actually care about the answer. They simply want something to say. They want a response that they can give. They honestly don't want to look up any of these things. They don't want to Google any of these things. They just want a response that they can give to any given circumstance online, a meme that they can post and not think about it again. Because if they say nothing, it looks like they've been beaten, right? You see politicians do this all the time. If you do lots of these in a row, it's called gish gallop. It's a classic logical fallacy in argument. But let's do the math and be totally clear on this. Reynor Best did the maths as of March 2020. One Bitcoin transaction on the blockchain costs 741 kilowatt hours of electricity to perform. That's the average electricity consumption for a single Bitcoin transaction. You could charge the battery for a Tesla 7 times with that. You could power the average electricity consumption of a home for weeks in exchange for just one transaction. Or you could get around 500,000 transactions via Visa. In other words, it's not even an argument. The electricity consumption of Bitcoin per transaction is vastly more than that of traditional banks. Vastly more. 500, 700,000 times more than doing a transaction via Visa. And if you think about it, it's obvious that this would be the case, isn't it? Because the whole point of this Bitcoin is that instead of having a central authority that you have to trust, who keeps the record, you have a big, energy-consuming, number-crunching extra step which requires you to rig up thousands of processors to crunch away at mathematical problems to secure that ledger. So of course it uses more energy. How could it not? Because Visa aren't doing that. They aren't solving all of these problems. They're just recording the transaction in their database. So the idea that it doesn't use more energy is ludicrous. Absolutely absurd. And sometimes people will do some bizarre thing where they work out the energy footprint of the traditional banking sector and the energy footprint of Bitcoin. You see memes of these. Often they have absolutely no citations for them whatsoever, probably because if you actually found out where this was calculated, it may as well be made up in the way that they're doing it. But the idea that you can compare an ATM that's dispensing cash with the Bitcoin as it exists at the moment, given how little use Bitcoin actually has practically at the moment, is ridiculous to me. Sometimes you'll also see people respond to this criticism by picking apart some particular analysis on a technical detail. They might say that, someone said that Bitcoin's electricity consumption is the same as that of Australia. It's really more like that of Sweden. My response to that sort of thing is, I don't care. It's wasted, whatever it is. There's always going to be a range of estimates for anything on this scale. There's always going to be a range of estimates for the carbon footprint too, which will be large. The point is that it's wasted and you're not getting much out of it, and it's not performing very much at the moment. So, that is the basis that I go on this here. There was an article, I want to give the other side here, there was an article called 3 Myths About Bitcoin's Energy Consumption. That was written by a company called Satoshi Labs. Okay, so I was looking up some people who had argued the other side of this case, who could, enlighten me as to what Bitcoin enthusiasts would say to defend themselves about this energy consumption. Satoshi is a unit of Bitcoin and also the name of the mythical founder of Bitcoin. So these guys are obviously enthusiasts. And they've written this article which people were sharing to say, don't worry about Bitcoin's energy consumption. which is what I've led off with as my main concern here. So let's talk about these myths that they identify, their so-called myths. First, they accuse people of conflating energy and electricity when they talk about Bitcoin. That's true, people do. I've talked about climate change a lot on this show, and you know that this is an annoying fact. It's true that you'll find plenty of popular articles that make silly or inconsistent comparisons because they've mixed this up. There's constantly headline writers who are conflating electricity or energy. But Satoshi Labs here are acting like this invalidates the argument because Bitcoin is using electricity, not energy. But as you know, that's very debatable. Electricity is high-grade energy. We convert heat into electricity from burning fossil fuels, for example, at 30% efficiency. In other words, the fact that it's using a kilowatt-hour of electricity, not energy, is arguably worse. More broadly, again, with anything, there are always going to be different ways of calculating precise things like energy and carbon footprints. I'm not really going to quote one particular study here. I've quoted a few that put it at different ballparks, but the point is we're talking about different orders of magnitude here, right? I find it hard to care. If some Bitcoin enthusiast proved to me that it was only using 70,000 times more per transaction than Visa, rather than 700,000 times more, that doesn't really undermine the point that all of this energy is being wasted, and it's a huge drawback to the cryptocurrency ever being used as anything other than a speculative asset. Which, people are trying to pretend that it isn't. Now, this also means that the transaction network is appallingly slow and inefficient. So Bitcoin, is using whatever the country is, Australia, Sweden, who cares? It's using mining apparatus equivalent to a small country's worth of electricity. And in exchange for that, you get just 350,000 transactions on the blockchain per day. Compare this to Visa alone, which does 150 million transactions per day. So, we're talking 500 times more transactions from Visa alone per day compared to Bitcoin. So, again, this comparison that, banks and Visa use energy too, yeah, but you get a lot more in exchange for it because it's vastly more efficient for obvious reasons, because that's exactly how the system is set up. And the problem here is that unless this scaling is ever sorted out, which there's no mechanism to do, at least for Bitcoin, it's absolutely laughable to suggest that Bitcoin can ever replace actual fiat currency. And the only reason people suggest that it can do is so that they can say, one day all transactions will be in Bitcoin, and therefore Bitcoins will be worth millions of dollars apiece, since only a finite amount of Bitcoins, I think 121 million or something, can ever be mined. The whole argument that Bitcoin will replace fiat currency, you're supposed to just take the total amount of currency that exists in the world and then divide that by the number of Bitcoins there would be when Bitcoin replaces currency. And then you get dollar signs in your eyes. Not Bitcoin symbols, obviously, because you still want dollars, really, when you calculate how much the Bitcoins would be worth if every dollar was replaced by a Bitcoin. But by then the network would be far too unwieldy to function. I mean, you're imagining a society here with no banks, no central banks, no governments actually, really, just transactions only over the Bitcoin. And if it's taking the electricity of a small country to do 350,000 transactions a day, then how many transactions would you be able to get on the blockchain if you were trying to do all of the world's transactions that way? I mean, would people just settle for not having the ability to do as many transactions in this future world? Would people be happy to do 1,000 times fewer transactions than they do at the moment? I don't see how that could possibly work. But this scaling can't possibly be sorted out. I mean, unless you're saying that you would really genuinely like so much more of the world's electricity to be devoted to mining apparatus, in which case you run into these ecological limits, you run into huge problems, and it's still intensely wasteful. So the idea that this cryptocurrency, particularly Bitcoin, is going to replace currency just doesn't work because it does not scale. And of course, we're not only talking about the environmental cost and the cost in terms of electricity, but also the transaction costs too. Because, of course, you're securing these transactions by mining the Bitcoins, and it requires electricity to process those transactions. And that means that the transaction fee for doing transactions on the blockchain is getting higher and higher and higher the more and more transactions there are, the more miners there are, the more Bitcoins there are out there, the transaction fee is increasing with the demand for this stuff. And the average transaction fee is already around $12. So again, if this is to replace fiat currency completely, you have to imagine a world where every transaction that takes place has a transaction fee of at least $12. And it would be much, much more, because obviously you'd have many, many more transactions taking place, right? So already imagine the number of transactions that you'd be willing to pay a transaction fee of $12 for. And that is going to increase and get exponentially worse as time goes on, because you have this insanely inefficient core at the heart of everything, which just makes it so much more expensive to do things, and in terms of electricity and in terms of cost. And that's simply it. Even profit-making companies, like PayPal or whatever, they won't be charging you $12 per transaction. So returning to the Bitcoin advocates' arguments then, having sort of debunked the idea that this will become some new currency. Now, Satoshi Labs' article was very strange here, because they said that a myth is that Bitcoin's energy consumption will only grow. Critics have said that Bitcoin's energy footprint will continue to grow pretty much exponentially as more people use it, as more transactions take place on the blockchain. There was one paper in Nature, for example, which said that if Bitcoin's trends continue, Bitcoin alone will help us blow past the 2 degrees Celsius warming target by 2033. And in that paper, they assume that Bitcoin becomes very popular and is used for a lot of different transactions, and that's how it produces all of these carbon emissions that alone blow past the Paris warming target through all of the emissions that are caused by mining Bitcoins. So Satoshi Labs attempt to debunk this, but they do so by pointing out how Bitcoin actually works. When the miners mine Bitcoin, doing those calculations that secure the ledger, they're rewarded in Bitcoin. But that reward is gradually halving over time. You're getting fewer and fewer Bitcoins for doing that work, which is part of what drives the price up over time, because the reward is getting rarer and scarcer as you mine it. So you're effectively getting paid less and less to do that work in terms of Bitcoin, as the total number of Bitcoins that are being produced goes down. But that means there's a break-even price for Bitcoin, right? Below which it's not worth bothering to pay for the electricity and mining gear. So, if you have to spend $50 of electricity and you're only getting $1 worth of Bitcoin for it, then you wouldn't do it, and therefore the whole thing collapses, and you're not going to have anyone mining Bitcoins and securing the blockchain anymore. So Satoshi Labs pointed out that if Bitcoin scales to the amount envisioned in the Nature paper, where it would now handle millions of transactions, instead of a few 100,000, each transaction will cost $80, and they work out that the coins themselves would need to be valued at $160 million each. So you need so much energy per transaction at this point, and the price of Bitcoin and the transactions would both have to be extremely high for this to function. And so Satoshi Labs argue, well, this is never going to happen. The miners will never mine Bitcoins for this reward because Bitcoins will never be worth that much. And this is kind of crazy, right? The defenders of Bitcoin are saying that we don't need to worry about it using up our entire carbon budget by itself because it will be impossibly expensive to use by then, and no one will be bothered to mine it. In other words, they're saying we shouldn't worry about the electricity consumption of Bitcoin because the whole thing will have collapsed by then anyway, and it can't possibly scale up to process that many payments. And this is supposed to convince me that we're not wasting time and electricity and carbon on Bitcoins. Don't worry, I'm not actually going to murder everyone on the planet, because eventually I'll run out of space in my garage, It's essentially an admission by these defenders that Bitcoin does not work as a currency at all because it's so wasteful. So they totally agree with the Nature paper's point, which is that a world where Bitcoin continues to grow and gets used for more than a tiny, tiny fraction of transactions would blow through the carbon budget by itself. They agree that it's a climate disaster. The argument is simply that it won't happen because it will collapse before it literally cooks the planet. But at that stage, obviously all of the electricity it's burned is shown up to be essentially useless, isn't it? Well, useless unless you made a lot of money from the hype around this cryptocurrency. Rarely do you see a defence that actually proves my point so precisely from an enthusiast. The response to Bitcoin can't possibly become a mainstream currency because if it did it would waste vast amounts of energy is, don't worry, Bitcoin will never replace currency because it would waste too much energy. But they still want me to buy it for some reason, and you wonder why. But their myth number 3 is even funnier. In this myth, they say that it's unfair to compare Bitcoin transactions to Visa transactions, because you don't have to do every Bitcoin transaction on the blockchain. And this is true, you can have accounts on cryptocurrency exchanges, where you buy and sell cryptocurrencies for each other and for dollars, which allow you to exchange cryptocurrencies without involving the blockchain at all. And this does use less energy than the transactions that are on the blockchain. So their argument is that people are overestimating the energetic costs of Bitcoin transactions by only including the ones that take place on the blockchain, and not these ones that take place away from the blockchain. But in other words, what they're saying here is that you can get more efficient and less wasteful transactions if you trust a third party, like the cryptocurrency exchange, to record and process those transactions for you. Do you maybe see how this undermines the entire purpose of a cryptocurrency and the whole value case you're supposed to be making for Bitcoin? Oh, Bitcoin doesn't use quite as much energy as you think because sometimes you can exchange it like a normal currency using a trusted third party. Then how is it not a huge waste of time? If your argument is that you can get more efficient by not using it as Bitcoin, then why does this exist? And this is precisely the point. I mean, it's obvious, right? That what they're saying in their busting of myth 3 is once again that Bitcoin is inherently more inefficient than a system where you trust someone, a third party, who can be regulated by laws, who can be, forced to pay out if they try and defraud you. But it's much less efficient to go through the blockchain than it is to trust a third party to do your transactions for you. So, the whole point of how it's set up is that you replace the simple trust you have of a central authority with this huge burden of computational work which computers have to do to try and overwrite the blockchain, which prevents it from being hacked from the outside. So yeah, I found it quite hilarious that I can look up articles by pro-Bitcoiners to see if I'm missing anything here and find this. The first point is irrelevant and arguably bad for them. The next 2 points just back up exactly what people are saying about how it can't be a true currency, that it's just a speculative financial asset, and therefore the electricity use and focus on it is a waste of time and energy, efforts, electricity and carbon. These pro-Bitcoin people make a better case for destroying it than I have done. But then I felt a bit sad reading this with the realisation that this is just one of many, many articles that isn't supposed to be read or analysed. It just exists so that the fans have something to link to without reading. It is essentially the article equivalent of mouth words, like so much of what a lot of crypto enthusiasts say, because ultimately what they really care about is the price of their token and selling it on to you. And therefore, whenever anyone mentions anything that criticises this, they immediately jump in and yell about how, they're misleading or they don't understand what's going on. It's not because they care about being right, but because it's about making money. Someone who is providing much more than mouthwords is Future interview victim Ketan Joshi, who just released a new article called Bitcoin is a Mouth Hungry for Fossil Fuels, where he sheds light on many other aspects of Bitcoin's climate problem. Just to remind you of the scale he talks about in the article, the annualized power consumption is about 128 terawatt hours of electricity to mine Bitcoin. So if you did it at this rate for a year, it would be 128 terawatt hours. That's comparable to a small country. The UK, for example, consumed 320 terawatt hours of electricity in 2019 compared to 128. Twice as much electricity is being used to mine Bitcoin as is currently being used to charge all of the world's electric cars. There's been a spate of documentaries recently which have talked about the pointing, watching Netflix has a hidden carbon footprint because of the electricity that Netflix's data centers use. This is true because, of course, Netflix has data centers which provide your streaming shows to you when you're locked down in the middle of a pandemic. But Bitcoin mining uses over 250 times as much electricity as Netflix does. It uses many times more than Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple combined. So even by the standards of computational uses of electricity in big data centers, it just blows everything else out of the water based on how incredibly inefficient it is. I mean, we're talking about a system here that is so inefficient that it's cheaper to stream billions and billions and billions of hours of video than it is to process a few 100,000 transactions on a blockchain. Now, it's hard to know exactly what fraction of this electricity is generated by fossil fuels, which makes it hard to know exactly what the carbon footprint is because of how decentralized the use is. There's miners everywhere. We don't know all of the mining software that's being used. We don't know all of the equipment and so on. And for some of these places, getting data off the carbon intensity of the grid, that is to say how many grams of CO2 are being emitted per kilowatt hour of electricity generated, is hard to get hold of. Cambridge University scholars did an estimate of this. They estimated that somewhere between 30 to 40% of the electricity used is renewable, with the rest being fossil fuels. That might be a slightly higher ratio than global electricity, by the way, because when you have a surfeit of renewable energy, some people will say, that's being used. You have a surplus of renewable energy, which makes energy cheap, electricity cheap, and therefore you're putting the electricity to work on the blockchain when it's at its cheapest, because the miners will be working out when their electricity is cheapest to do their computational work. But even if it was all renewable electricity, which it isn't, we know that 60 to 70% of it is fossil fuels and is emitting CO2. I'd still rather see the quote-unquote excess being used somewhere, doing something of value. With greater interconnectivity, there will always be fossil fuels being burned on the grid somewhere. It would be much better if that so-called excess renewable power was displacing fossil fuels somewhere else, rather than depending on some bubble in Bitcoin mining. Indeed, if you're building a renewable power plant and you have this surplus electricity that you want to sell to someone, wouldn't it be much better if you're incentivized to build some new project to do that? Like, you want to build some batteries so that you can store the electricity and sell it on, or you want to build some transitions so that you can send it somewhere else and sell it on, or you want to convert it into hydrogen or something like that, anything like that really, so that you can balance this oversupply and get some use out of it. But actually what Bitcoin does is it just provides this thing that is sucking up this excess electricity. And so you don't get the batteries built, you don't get the transmission built, you don't get the hydrogen plant built, because someone is willing to pay for that electricity already, to do something that I have argued is basically useless. And this is really the opposite of what we want, that oversupply. Some companies have started to referring to Bitcoin as an economic battery, which they can charge up when they have oversupply. But if it's an economic battery, it's not doing anything. Oversupply from renewables is a good thing, if we can use it to create and drive this energy storage, hydrogen, displacing fossil fuels with these large transmission lines, charging electric appliances and batteries cheaply, or even to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere with direct air capture. We're scripting an episode on that at the moment, and one of the potential advantages of those machines, which do require a lot of energy to function, is that you could use them to balance the excess in supply of renewable energy at times when it's particularly windy or sunny compared to demand. But you don't want to use it to mine tokens instead. But if suppliers can make more money from these tokens because of how irrational the market is, they won't bother with these other vital industries that are not about wasting the plentiful bounty from the sun and wind, and are instead about actually using it to provide things that improve people's lives. And if Satoshi Labs, the Bitcoin enthusiasts, are right, eventually people won't be bothered to mine Bitcoin anymore because it won't be worthwhile. At which point, all of that infrastructure that could have been built, but wasn't built because people were doing this useless thing instead, will still not have been built. So it's a disaster, even if it is using renewable electricity. But we know that a lot of it isn't, and a lot of it is using fossil fuels, and thereby just contributing to environmental destruction for very little purpose. As a species-wide thing, you just think, this is not what we need to be doing when we have a very, very limited amount of CO2 we can continue to emit in the next 10, 20 years to avoid blowing through the targets beyond which climate change starts getting to be much, much worse than it is at the moment. Joshi outlines another trend too, which is fossil fuel companies. They often have to burn excess methane and natural gas as they extract fossil fuels in a process known as flaring. Bitcoin enthusiasts are now teaming up with fossil fuel companies to convert this burned off natural gas into a Bitcoin mining operation. Now, the fossil fuel companies claim that this is cheaper because, they're burning the gas anyway, now they're using it to make some Bitcoin. But in actuality, it's giving fossil fuel companies another new revenue stream from their waste product. And so it's helping them to produce this waste product, in a way that is inefficient. There's no incentive for them to capture it or to prevent it from happening or to stop flaring if they can make money from flaring. And by giving them more money from mining Bitcoin, Bitcoin is helping them to survive longer at a time when we need to be moving away from fossil fuels and fast. There are in fact several, albeit small, fossil fuel power plants that are being set up right now, solely for the purpose of mining Bitcoin, at a time when we just can't afford to build this new infrastructure for any purpose. But if there is only so much carbon that we have left to emit, I'd much rather that we're using that energy to, heat the homes of old people, to perform urgent transportation that can't be done in other ways. It's like a rationing system, and we only have so much carbon budget left to deal with a certain amount of climate change damage on the other end of it. So some continued use of CO2, of carbon-intensive fossil fuels and some continued CO2 emissions are inevitable over the next 10, 20, 30 years. But that should be focused as much as possible on stuff that's necessary, and not this very unnecessary speculation. And letting these fossil fuel companies monetize their inefficiency and waste is not going to be a clean alternative, even though Bitcoin's advocates suggest that it somehow is clean. His article on this, and some of the political belief systems which underlie the willingness to dismiss this climate criticism, is seriously good. So I strongly recommend that you read that for more information. But the gist of it is that in some cases you have active climate change deniers or hyper-libertarians who despise the government and are sceptical of climate change because they think climate change is made up by governments or whatever. But in most cases it's just a dogpile army of folks who can't hear anything that damages Bitcoin's reputation because they're worried it might damage its price. Because for them, it is a speculative asset that they want to buy low and sell high. And that's it. Now, I just want to say that just like there are some blockchains and cryptocurrencies which try to do some useful work as part of the proof of work, there are also cryptocurrencies working towards the scaling problem. I wrote an article a few years ago for Singularity Hub called Towards an Efficient Scalable Cryptocurrency, which was based on an academic piece of the same name. Now, I don't really want to go into those other algorithms in detail. I'm sure they have their own pros and cons from a different point of view. But the point is that if you think this blockchain idea and the avoidance of central trust is an important and useful thing that is worth something, that is worthwhile, that is worth expenditure of energy, you can get that now. Cheaper, differently, without this massive energy drawback. But not with Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is still using the old technology. And Bitcoin enthusiasts aren't adopting these new currencies or these new blockchains. They aren't using them, they aren't promoting them, they're just talking about Bitcoin mostly. And the reason why is because they're invested in Bitcoin and they want the price to go up. That's it, that's the motivation. People have developed other cryptocurrencies that would work better than this. But they're not interested in promoting those to nearly the same extent as they want to defend Bitcoin, because for them, it is not some revolutionary new form of currency. It's a speculative investment asset. That's the same reason Elon Musk bought a load of Bitcoin and started tweeting about it and retweeting misleading threads about its energy consumption. He wanted the price to go up. It's as simple as that. Maybe some of these people, these enthusiasts, genuinely have deluded themselves that the world of central banks will collapse, or that Bitcoin genuinely is some magical technology that they don't really understand but they want to own. Or maybe they're just telling you that because they want to sell their Bitcoins to you or someone like you. Many of these people are very smart and doubtless good at selling the story, but their responses to critics do not convince me at all. So we've established that Bitcoin in particular is very bad for the environment and inherently wasteful in its consumption of electricity. But now I want to just explain to you why I really don't think we're actually getting anything good in exchange for that. So now we come to the claimed benefits of the blockchain itself and storing transactions on the blockchain. Yes, it's true that no one can come in from the outside and alter the blockchain, and advocates claim that this makes it safe from fraud or loss. You no longer need to trust banks to protect you from fraud or loss because the blockchain is inherently secure. But secure against what? You have to consider what types of fraud are actually the most common. Let's say that you have been defrauded using your bank account or on PayPal. You've lost some money somehow. What's more likely? Scenario A. Someone hacked into your account with your username and password and sent 10 grand to me in a way that appears to be a legitimate transaction. Scenario B. Someone tricked you into putting your information, your payment information, in somewhere with a phishing website, and you accidentally authorised a transaction yourself that you didn't really want to do. Or maybe you just made a mistake or paid for something twice. Scenario C. Someone has obtained your payment information. It's been hacked from some third-party website where you've put the payment information. They have access to everything they need and they've made some payments. It's not you, but it looks like it's from you because they have your information. And wherever they've paid for things is not robust enough to have any second way of checking, like there's no two-factor authentication. Or scenario D. Someone hacked into PayPal or your bank's central system and changed all of their records so that it looks like you've made these payments and that your account is in debit to my account, say. Obviously that last scenario is the least common, right? how often does someone hack into the bank and alter the bank's records to change how much money everyone has, or to access everyone's accounts centrally from the bank? Hardly ever, right? This is the type of thing that Bitcoin does protect you from because no one can alter the ledger. But it cannot possibly protect you from scenarios A, B, and C. It can't prevent someone from stealing your Bitcoins or tricking you into giving them away because they have your payment information or because they have access to your account somehow. And these are far more common types of fraud. Worse, when there's a third party mediating transactions, you have hope that PayPal or Visa or your bank can cancel the fraudulent transaction and you'll get your money back. In the worst case scenario, if your bank collapses, the government will often step in and defend the deposits that are there. But in the case of Bitcoin, you have no hope. It's gone forever, and since in many cases you won't be able to track who the recipient is, or how the payments were made, and the transaction is definitely irreversible, you'll have no way of tracking down the person who did it, and you'll have no way of automatically reversing the transaction, or stopping the transaction once any request has been submitted, as you might be able to with scammers on PayPal or Visa, or when you ring your bank and tell them to cancel transactions, cancel your card, change your details, and so on. Once these things are compromised, they're gone. Now, this same point, by the way, also applies to lots of other suggested uses for the blockchain more generally. You'll see people proposing that it can be used for supply chains, for example, to ensure that data entered along the way about the product that's going through its supply chain is not corrupted or falsified, which secures trust. Sometimes this has a climate spin. Now you can trust that your product has a certain CO2 footprint, say. But again, the obvious problem here is that there's very rarely problems due to externally hacking the database. Who is coming in and externally hacking a supply chain database to alter what's been put into it, to change what's there? Surely a bigger problem, Amazon is not having its supply chain databases hacked by someone at the end of that supply chain who change all of the data and information that's been put in. Much more common is that someone who's actually entering the data at one stage makes a mistake or does something intentionally fraudulent. People can still lie to you. There's still the element of deceit that can definitely happen. The person you can't trust is the other parties in this calculation, not the central authority who is keeping track of this ledger. Blockchain is not only powerless to prevent this, but once you've committed your data to it, you can't then alter it if it was fraudulent or mistaken. So it's a garbage in, garbage out problem that's still very prevalent. And this secures a sort of trust that works, providing you're sure that no one will ever lie to you. But it gets much worse than this, because in theory, the idea that someone would steal your Bitcoin is difficult, because your Bitcoin transactions would be between individuals who store the certificates on their hard drives or wallets, and they send codes to each other that complete the transaction. So that can be secure. You can make it very secure if you want. You can have all of this digital information, on a keychain, on a USB drive, and only you know where it is, and in a wallet that's behind a password. Indeed, sometimes, there's plenty of examples of cases where people have actually made their Bitcoins too secure, and they've got access to a fortune in Bitcoin that they now can't get hold of because they've forgotten their password. Which is another example, of course, where you might want some central authority who can sort out these sort of things for you, rather than just relying on this decentralized approach. But, that's just from the simple standpoint of consumers who might want a currency that works for them and doesn't sometimes mean they lose their life savings because they forgot one password. That's not the kind of world that Bitcoin people are interested in. No. It's not about actually having a currency that functions in the way people have expected currencies to do. It's a bit like these people who are obsessed with deregulation for the sake of it. And the issue is, of course, that if your aim is just, I want to destroy some regulations, what you need to do is sort of look back into why the regulations are there in the first place. I mean, there's generally reasons for that. So, in theory, if everyone was doing this the proper way, the hardcore way, these Bitcoin transactions would be between individuals storing the certificates on their wallets and sending codes to each other. But this is not actually how it's done in practice. Nearly everyone who owns this stuff, at least some step of the way, generally when it comes to purchasing the Bitcoins, but sometimes for exchanging them too, relies on exchanges or websites that buy and hold your cryptocurrencies for you, like Coinbase as an example. But you see what this means, right? This means that ultimately your Bitcoins are behind another account with a username and password that can be hacked, just like a PayPal account. So in terms of secure transactions, you're only as secure as the weakest link. And the weakest link is generally where you convert your real currency into cryptocurrencies. And unfortunately, these weakest links historically have been much, much weaker than banks. These exchanges and platforms for cryptocurrencies get hacked all the time. In fact, hackers absolutely love to target them. The reasons why are obvious. Not only are they shady and sometimes poorly regulated enterprises, especially a few years ago, there were constantly these things were being hacked or shutting down or running out of money, and people would make off with king's ransoms in cryptocurrencies. These things can't invest in security that banks can and PayPal and Visa can. They're not backed up by governments because governments are keeping this stuff at arm's length and they're not regulating it properly. They're sort of saying invest in it on your own risk and all this sort of thing. If you do successfully hack these places where people keep their cryptocurrency, you can just funnel it to yourself in a way that is irreversible and hopefully hard to trace so that you can just run off with it. And they won't be able to track you down in nearly the same easy ways that you can do in the case of a bank. So, the way people actually use these cryptocurrencies is much less secure than the way that they generally do transactions, because they have this massive weak link where they're interfacing with the thing that is supposedly secure. And people claiming that this is more secure and that the trust that you no longer need is solving a problem. It's solving a problem that simply doesn't exist. Now, I can see some people saying here, but they could use it properly, they just choose not to at the moment. But given that so many people are choosing not to, does this maybe not demonstrate that the thing you're claiming is the revolutionary potential of this technology? The fact that you don't need to trust a central authority is just not worth that much to people in practice? Like, they could do it, but they can't be bothered to find out how to do it. They find it too inconvenient, so they go with a trusted third party for convenience or lack of expense. So, is that not in itself an argument that this is not the major boom in technology that it's cracked up to be? This is what we're getting in exchange for having something that's 700,000 times more inefficient than the standard method of processing transactions that's burning through a third of the electricity that Britain is using in a year to secure a few 100,000 transactions, a tiny fraction of the transactions that are processed by mainstream processing and Visa. Even many crypto enthusiasts who own these cryptocurrencies can't be bothered with using it properly to forego central trust. In fact, they're often willing to trust these exchanges that they know are less secure than banks and that have been hacked and shut down in the past on a regular basis. So, is this killer app really all that if the people who claim to love it often can't be bothered to have it? Similar issues, supply the supposed uses for blockchain more generally. For example, people suggest you can use this incorruptible ledger to record everything that happens to a product through the supply chain, ensuring at each point that it's sustainably sourced or tracking carbon emissions or whatever, so you have access to the full record of where it's been at the end. Only problem is you could do that already, it's just that people don't put that information in there. You could do it with any computer database. The only advantage the blockchain gives is that no one could hack into or alter the previous entries in the ledger, but people can just lie to you. Julius Voles put it quite well on Twitter. He said, "Blockchain buys a single core feature of eliminating centralized trust at an extreme cost along every other technical, societal and environmental dimension. At the same time, it's debatable whether that lack of centralized trust is even a pro or whether it's even delivered." So we've established that Bitcoin, as it currently works, will not take over from actual currencies. We've established it's a pretty bad and intentionally wasteful way of making payments. We've established it doesn't protect you from the most common types of fraud, but actually makes them perhaps more likely and more irreversible. For most transactions, you want that third party there to help you keep track of things, police the transactions, reverse them if necessary, and so that someone is liable at the end of the day. And ultimately, the state and the government can back up and help you out in cases of fraud. Some Bitcoin enthusiasts have started to acknowledge that Bitcoin itself won't actually be used for many practical transactions, except in the few limited cases where you really, really don't want to be traced, certainly not to the same scale that currency is. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't a few niche applications, your generic crimes and stuff. Maybe not all of these crimes are bad. There might be some cases where you're evading some authority that is not a good authority. I'm sure there are individual isolated cases where people have used this semi-anonymity for good reasons. And I'm not saying there aren't circumstances where you could use it for that. But I also don't think that any of the people who are constantly hyping up the price actually do use it for that. And I also don't think that a few isolated good use cases is going to make this thing justifies the valuation that this thing has at the moment, or justifies the immense amount of hype around it, or makes me think that it's likely to replace any sort of currency anytime soon. So what is the investment case that these people make? Well, now we have to change from the idea that it's a medium of exchange or a currency towards the idea that it is a store of value. And the concept here is, well, there will only ever be a finite number of bitcoins. We know that's true. 21 million, I think. So perhaps they could have some permanent value based on the demand for them. And indeed, unlike other currencies, because you're getting less and less of them mined over time, the currency, theoretically, is not going to be subject to inflation because you can't produce more, at least on the supply end, right? But of course, we know that inflation is a matter of supply and demand, so the price of the thing can change based on demand solely, rather than just the supply at a stage where the supply is finally fully constrained. The trouble is, when you have something that's supposed to be a currency but sort of isn't, it's not entirely clear why it's valuable. The only reason it's valuable is that there is demand for it, and that makes it, to me, a speculative asset, now that we've said that its uses aren't really uses. And by the way, people should be very clear, none of this is investment advice. I'm not saying the price will crash tomorrow. Like any Ponzi, and yes, this has Ponzi dynamics, it's impossible to predict when it will end. But it is a Ponzi in the sense that 99.9% of the people who are buying in are ultimately hoping to make money by selling it on at a higher price, and therefore they rely on an endless stream of greedy buyers who are hoping for the price to continue to rise. I don't know how long that dynamic can go on. I said, talking in earlier Thermonuclear Takes episodes about Ponzi's, these dynamics can go on for an incredibly long time. The price could double or treble or quadruple, could stay high for years, or it could crash to nothing tomorrow. If you want to gamble on any of those things happening, it's up to you, and good luck to you. If you think you can make money doing that, that's fine. That's the way that most people seem to make their money now, in various different Ponzi's of one kind or another, so go ahead. If you ask me to make a prediction, I would personally expect the price would continue to be volatile, go up and down, until there's another major recession, and then I think the value will start to crater. But it's not like buying the Mona Lisa, it seems likely to me that people will continue to believe that fine art is valuable for its uniqueness and for its aesthetic qualities, and will continue to value paintings by similar painters for at least until cultural changes come in and start to make these things seen as less valuable, right? There's always some degree of fashion as to how much these things are worth. But it seems unlikely to me that people will still feel the same way about cryptocurrencies, when it's clear that everyone involved is hoping to sell their investment onto a higher price to a greater fool, when the trends are over, when the hype dies down, when it's clear that the price is no longer volatile enough to make money out of it. Or maybe when people start issuing, if the lack of centralised trust thing is such a good thing, given that we now know it can be done more efficiently, and that it can be done more effectively, and that it can be done, with better algorithms, why would we still use this one? If you're a believer in the technology of blockchain, then you must feel very sketchy about the use case in future for Bitcoin itself. Because it would be a bit like saying that you believe in the internet, but you also believe that the first ever website is going to be the only one to work, because this was the first ever example. And obviously there have been improvements since. There's a reason we're not all using the same operating system now. There's a reason that we're not all still visiting the websites that we used to visit in the very, very early days of the internet, because improvements have been made. So the more you believe in the blockchain technology, the less you should believe that the price of Bitcoin and the value of it will remain high. Of course, if you just believe that it's something that will sustain itself based on people continuing to be interested in it and continuing to want to hold it as a speculative asset, that's fine. Maybe it will. But I think that just then becomes a depressing thing about the whole endeavour to me, because you then sort of realise that it's not really built on any foundations at all, aside from a sort of shared belief that it's worth something. And it truly is then just pure speculation. People could be trading or exchanging biscuits. They could be trading or exchanging anything that collectively people had considered for some reason that we're seeing increasingly as irrational is worth something. So, it seems a very hollow endeavour then. It seems like a waste of time, a misallocation of resources, and how much of the technological promises we're making to ourselves are like that. Some people say you should buy it as a hedge against inflation, and they try to go down the gold bug route. For those who don't know, as soon as you get interested in finance, you find that a lot of people are convinced that the financial system will totally collapse and the only thing that retains its value will be gold, therefore buy gold. Not really a fan of that line of argument either, for different reasons, but it attracts some people for similar reasons. But then the idea that this is a hedge against inflation is crazy, right? It relies on thinking that what monetary policy is doing now is capable of producing massive hyperinflation for it to make sense. You have a dollar that might lose 2% of its value a year due to inflation. And you're saying you want to hedge against that by buying something that regularly loses 15% of its value overnight, as it did recently. If it's a hedge, your hedge is on fire. Your hedge is far more volatile than the currency that it's supposedly hedging against. So I don't really buy into this argument that it's a hedge against inflation. Some people might say that, if you had an inflationary financial crisis and people's dollars were losing value, they would buy into cryptocurrencies because they would hope that they would retain their value because there's a finite amount of them. And again, I don't really see that, because when you look at historical financial crises, like, for example, the COVID panic, everyone sold cryptocurrencies very rapidly. They didn't pile into them when they saw disaster coming because they thought they'd retain their value when currencies would collapse. They piled out of them because they thought, this is a speculative investment and I don't know what it's going to do. So unless the hedge against inflation thing becomes some crazy self-fulfilling prophecy where everyone has repeated the mantra that this is a store of value, it is valuable, and people believe in its value more than they believe in the value of anything else they could buy with their money, then I just don't see that as an investment case for it. And it seems very bizarre that you would want something that's fundamentally supported by absolutely nothing and that has absolutely no practical value as your hedge against inflation, when you could buy things that people need and can use for something. But in many ways, the reason that I bring up the gold bugs is that the case that is used for this has to be quite a dramatically stated one. You really have to maximise the idea that this lack of trust or central authority is a huge, huge revolutionary thing. And then you can get into these very dramatic philosophical or political cases for bitcoins. And then it sort of almost becomes like a religion at this stage. It's not an actual currency. No. It's not a technology. It's more of a sort of symbol, a hedge against collapse. And it kind of divides into two branches. So one is the familiar apocalyptic one from the gold bug type arguments. These sort of argue that the Federal Reserve central banks will destroy the dollar, they'll destroy fiat currencies, they'll print trillions of them, and that will cause hyperinflation, and the banks will collapse, and fire and brimstone will rain down upon us. And the only things left that people will recognise for currency, for payment, is obviously gold. I mean Bitcoin. Yeah, it'll be Bitcoin and gold. But Bitcoin. And in this anarchic world where all banks and financial institutions have collapsed and there is no central state control over anything and there's no taxation, well, in my view, and I'm sure yours as well, there is no society. Why would anyone accept digital tokens in this post-apocalyptic wasteland? It's a bizarre and nonsensical anarcho-capitalist or hyper-libertarian paradise that dreams of a world that exists without any state whatsoever, which doesn't just descend into arrant violence. And one thing that happens when you don't have a state, where we define the state as the ones who have a legitimate monopoly on the use of force, is that suddenly there's an oligopoly on the use of force, right? Everyone can use force. I don't want to live in that world. I would be much more afraid that in such a situation, rather than reverting to accepting gold or digital tokens as some natural currency in exchange for the food or water that they have access to, people would kill me and take my stuff instead. Or genuinely, perhaps for the first time, engage in barter for goods that obviously have a value to each other, as opposed to some digital token that is incredibly expensive to transact. You only have a little bit of your electricity left in this horrendous post-apocalyptic future where all governments and all currencies have collapsed and no one can use currency anymore. So why are you spending all your electricity on doing blockchain transactions to get some eggs from the local farmer or some more bullets for your gun? I'm terrified of this investment case. It seems to me that it will basically be invest in Bitcoin because soon society will collapse and we'll all hate and suspect each other so much that there can be no trusted authorities, no governments, no tokens that you will accept, no one's guarantee that you will accept. Because that's ultimately what money is about, right? It's about a sort of knowledge that ultimately someone, somewhere, typically a state, typically it's a creature of laws, it's a creature of governments, is going to back this up. When the Romans paid their soldiers in coins bearing the head of the emperor, the price of that coin was related to the authority of the emperor and the belief that they had that they could exchange that for useful things. That's how currencies work. But of course, the decentralized currency can't really work like that, except by a sort of global mutual consensus to its value. And I think you're being very optimistic if you think that systems of global mutual consent or assent would exist in this. It's a little bit like there's a lot of anarcho-capitalist philosophies where they seem to think that you could get away without a government as long as everyone agrees not to be aggressive towards each other. And yeah, I suppose so. I suppose as long as everyone at all times agrees not to be aggressive towards each other, you could have some sort of world that doesn't descend into massive violence. But then, of course, how would you resolve any disputes that arose between any two groups of people? What if people decided not to respect each other's property rights anymore? It's a little bit distressing. And I'm not sure it's the kind of world I want to live in, and I don't think it's the kind of world where bitcoins are actually worth something. And the idea is to me that buying it would be a hedge against such apocalyptic events, that it will somehow keep its value through this apocalyptic event, is belied to me by the very nature of itself as it exists in the world in practice. Not in theory, not in some imagined world where we all have mining rigs and we use them to generate the currency that we trade in this post-government, post-everything society. Who owns it as it exists in the world in reality? Some institutional investors, some enthusiasts, and day traders who are trading it up and down. Why do they own it? Predominantly as a speculative asset that they hope will appreciate in value and that they can make money from. Not despite what they have to say to each other or to us, out of some conviction that it will replace the dollar or be worth something after the Federal Reserve and society in general collapses, and all that's left is peer-to-peer stuff because all authorities have collapsed. They clearly can't be regularly using it as a currency on blockchain themselves, or there would be more transactions. And because of the nature of the people who are holding it, what happens when there's a catastrophe? People sell out of it and get out of Dodge. They get scared, like investors do, who, I was only hoping to make money from this speculative asset, the price is going down, time to sell. We saw that in March when there was the big COVID panic and the price of Bitcoin collapsed faster than the stock market did, as investors fled for the hills. Now, there is a slightly less apocalyptic way to put this price for investing in crypto, though, and this was what my emailer, the blockchain fan, essentially subscribed to, and I thank him for putting his case forward. He said, quote, "Governments have had decades to crack down on the rich evading taxes, so why should we trust them with our future when they clearly just don't care? I feel like technologies like the blockchain could really change this. They get a lot of bad publicity, but when you get technical, they really are magical. I'm sure you know lots of people don't have bank accounts. Systems are being built to give these people a real identity and real access to a financial system that runs on the blockchain." So you can see that the fans are selling this as some way of escaping from the greedy hegemony of banks, bankers, and centralised control. And the idea is that we can undermine these by setting up our own system which relies only on us and doesn't rely on them. And this works because everyone is intrinsically suspicious of institutions like the Fed and central banks and so on. And often, as I'm sure you would agree, for many of the wrong reasons. But I have sympathy for people who feel this way, who feel like the financial system as it exists is being run by people who are in it for themselves, who don't have society's best interests at heart, and therefore feel maybe that it needs to be destroyed from the outside. And sometimes this is expressed with a very strong anti-government bent, or sometimes it's, other things. You can make yourself untraceable and free from authorities or whatever, but yourself, that kind of thing. But I would point out a few things to those people. Firstly, I hope I've made the case here that Bitcoin itself can't scale to replace currencies if we want to have anything like the number of transactions we do today, and I would contend that we do. This applies to the apocalyptic case too. If you're betting on a society that puts absolutely zero trust in banks or other financial institutions to hold and process monies and payments, even then, how are we going to get past a few million transactions a day at most without using more electricity than many countries are generating? I mean, what happens to the other transactions that we want to do? Are they all dead, the people who would do those? Explain how that works to me. It's also not an actual threat to the existing financial system, except in the sense where it allows for untraceable transactions which might be associated with criminal activity to take place. I think if it was seen as a genuine threat, it would simply be banned. That would not be hard for them to do the way things are at present. If you outlawed people exchanging these cryptocurrencies for actual currencies, I imagine it would very quickly become something pretty fringe, even if you couldn't outright stop it from being used. And I think we know deep down that most people who have cryptocurrencies want to exchange them for more dollars than they bought them for. I wonder how many dyed-in-the-wool enthusiasts who would ramble for days about how brilliant cryptocurrencies are. If you told them that they had to sell now, or keep their crypto forever in Bitcoin form, never selling for any sort of other currency, how many of them would sell now? I would guess 99.9%. So, in short, all of the fantasies which say it has value because and then refers to some use it could have as a medium of exchange, I think are just false, particularly for Bitcoin being such an inefficient cryptocurrency. Hacker Noon, the blog, had a good explanation of why it hasn't been banned yet, and it essentially comes down to the point that the transactions won't scale to replace actual currencies, and the transition point where everyone suddenly starts accepting Bitcoin and conducting all transactions on the blockchain using it, that can't ever arise because the thing would collapse under its own weight at that point. That would never happen because transactions would become far expensive and the price too high. I'm a little bit confused by my interlocutor who says he's worried about tax evasion, and yet he also wants ways that people could, in his view, come up with untraceable means of transactions. I don't really see how that works. It's I find this to be a very cynical and negative point of view, that because the governments we have at the moment aren't working for us, we simply need to do away with governments, because ultimately, what is a government? Forget the details of your individual political system and all of the gripes that you have with it. Forget, whether you don't think that the way that your democracy is set up is working. Forget the horrendous aspects of politics. The basic idea of a government is collective action on behalf of a group of people. That group of people could be a smaller community if you wanted it to. Could be a community where everyone knows each other. It could be a community where, thousands of people know each other. It could be a nation state, which is what we have at the moment, in most cases. But the point is that you have this collective authority that acts on behalf of the whole group. And if you're going to abandon that principle entirely, we could have massive reforms of that principle. And I would agree with many massive reforms of that principle. But I think if you're abandoning that principle entirely and just saying everyone has to end up fending for themselves in some way or another, or operating on a form of mutual trust where we all have the same ideology, that might be a utopia for many, 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 many years in the future. In a world where there's not much scarcity anymore, in a world where we don't need to enforce regulations, in a world where people's enlightened empathy and compassion for each other dominates. I don't see it. I don't see us living in that world at the moment. I don't see the idea that you could abolish collective action, and regulations that are enforced ultimately, yes, by the monopoly over the legitimate use of force. I don't see it happening anytime soon. And I think the problems we have at the moment require more than anything governments to solve, certainly not markets by themselves. And so I think it's not an idea that we can dispense with, in my view. If you disagree and think we're ready to dispense with it now, and that it's impossible to reform governments and that there's no sense in even trying or hoping to, then you can make that case to me. But somehow I think that it's going to be easier to convince people that governments need reforms and to change the political system and reform it as it exists, but maintaining the concept of a government, because that actually requires less convincing and persuading and like-mindedness, I guess, on behalf of the people, than a system where we would abolish all governments and regulations but still find ways not to evolve, descending into violence and might makes right, and we would still find ways to protect things like the environment and the rights of the workers and the interests of the most vulnerable and all these sort of things that governments can or should be doing for us. I think it would be easier to reform the system than to abolish it. And I don't think deep down people would think that is that controversial. And I think that if your only investment case for Bitcoin is that governments will imminently collapse or should imminently collapse, I don't think if that's your main case, then I'm not convinced. But governments, as they exist now, can regulate, and often do, when you want to change your crypto back into normal currencies. Just as that is the weak point for fraud, that is also the weak point for this as a means of evading the regulation of governments, if that's what you want to do. So, just as we've said that the argument about safety from fraud is blown up because the weakest link is this interface between the crypto and the real world, the same is true of trying to evade the government. And they can use these exchanges to monitor the flows of Bitcoin, just like they might subpoena the bank for records if you try and use your bank to do crimes today. But I do think that a world without governments at the moment would be violent and much worse than the world we inhabit today, even given how corrupt governments are and can be at the moment. There's a great takedown of this kind of philosophy published by Naked Capitalism called Journey into a Libertarian Future, which takes the form of 5 lengthy imagined dialogues between someone who wants no government and someone who's interviewing them. And it's great because they literally quote passages from these sort of foundational texts of libertarianism and hyper-libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism as part of the interview. And it's interesting to see how they get the personality of the interviewer by quoting some of the most eminent philosophers from this realm of extremist politics, I guess you could say. So that's some recommended reading there if you want to get more of a sense of my view of how that kind of world would shake out. And, I know some people will disagree with this, but I have arguments that are agnostic to how you feel about this question. But I don't find the fantasy persuasive at all. I don't really see it as a use case for blockchain. I don't think this is some technology that is so magical it enables a totally different means of society being organised. And certainly that has nothing to do with the price of Bitcoin at the moment. I think we should look to do things like break up the big banks if they're not working for us. We should break the power of the financial system relative to the people, move towards a democracy that's more one person, one vote, and less $1, one vote. Those would all be great things to do. But it is possible to regulate things so that people can go to jail when fraud occurs. It is possible to elect people who will enforce those laws, It would be possible to do all sorts of things that might resolve any problem you have with a trusted third party, which wouldn't have the same social scale and environmental problems that blockchain, particularly Bitcoin, seems to have. And I certainly don't see this fantasy as a reason to support the world of cryptocurrencies as it exists today. And I think part of the issue here is that even if you do believe that buying Bitcoin is striking a blow against a corrupt system, elements of the corrupt system long ago co-opted it. You're not really rebelling against the government or the financial establishment or central banks or whoever you think is acting to fix prices and manipulate markets, because you're moving your assets into an area that has some of the worst and most egregious fraud, market manipulation, pump and dump schemes, etc. that you'll ever see. It is a vastly more rigged game than the real economy. The price of Bitcoin itself is constantly manipulated, most recently through the so-called stablecoin Tether. Tether is a cryptocurrency which aims to always be worth $1 and claims to always have $1 of assets in reserve to back its value. So it's like a sort of cryptocurrency with a fiat currency as a gold standard. So the gold standard back in the day for currencies, you knew that for every dollar that was printed, there was always some gold in Fort Knox somewhere. This would do the same thing, but you have a cryptocurrency and there's always supposed to be some dollars in Fort Knox somewhere to back that up. Its main use is to buy and sell bitcoins in a convenient way because you have this exchange rate of $1 to 1 tether. But as far back as 2017, it was discovered that Tether only backed 73% of the tethers that existed with currency. In other words, the rest was being printed. Most people now seem to tacitly accept that the organisation that produces these things is basically just printing them at will. So for all the people who are paranoid about the Fed printing money that will devalue the currency, their solution is to invest in a scheme where a private organisation that's not backed by the government, that's not backed by the monopoly on the legitimate use of force, that's not backed by law, that could stop existing tomorrow, genuinely just does print virtual money to pump up the price of Bitcoin and keep the price of Tether stable. And they have no state power behind them to actually do anything about the values of their assets if they're pumping. Tether can't tax people to bring in the dollars that it doesn't have because it printed tethers by itself. It doesn't have the currency capacity and the recognition that the fiat currency does. And so it's madness to say that you're getting into a more secure or safer system. It sort of feels like you're out of the hot bath and into the fire if you're relying on this to be a less manipulated market. And, I wouldn't be surprised if everyone involved with this Tether thing just has a go bag on the ready, stuffed to the brim with false passports and lots of actual fiat currency, just waiting for the day that that particular bubble pops. And this is but the largest of many bubbles that have been inflated by cryptocurrency enthusiasts. There was an article, expose, The Economics of Cryptocurrency Pump and Dump Schemes in 2019, which was published again on Naked Capitalism and also in an academic journal where it was originally published. That illustrated how much of what was being done was literally just being done through WhatsApp and Telegram groups where they agree to pump a certain coin and then sell at a given time. John McAfee did that all the time. He had a cryptocurrency of the week we've talked about, promoted it to his gullible followers, they'd buy it, price would spike, mysteriously it would slump again, almost as if he himself was selling the coins he'd bought the week before. Getting scammed is one thing, but getting scammed by the same guy, by the same scam on a weekly basis is pretty impressive, right? And he's now been indicted by the SEC several years too late. One also wonders what the SEC made of Elon Musk deciding to hype up the price of Dogecoin, an obvious meme, in the sort of week or month of the meme stocks, which also spiked after his tweet. So yeah, there's lots of scams being run in the crypto world, much worse than the ones on the outside, which means the arguments about, oh, it defends you against fraud, or it's an inflation hedge, ring hollow, because the inflation and the manipulation and the fraud is much worse in this world than it is on the outside. It creates worse problems than it solves, and there's no regulations to help you and back you up when things do go badly. You're worried that currencies are subject to manipulation by banks and governments, so you're going to put your assets in something that are regularly and intentionally manipulated by rich guys tweeting, really? And, there's a good reason to hate pump and dump schemes like this, because ultimately the people who get burned in them are essentially victims. They're the ones who show up late to the party. They've heard stories about how other people have become overnight millionaires doing this. They've been sold, if not on the merits of blockchain or Bitcoin, on the hype, the idea, the prospect of success. Like people who, go in for multi-level marketing schemes or something. They think, if I get in on this at the right time, I will be the one to be successful. I can reproduce the success of others. And these people aren't necessarily idiots, but they're tempted into it because they see the egregiousness of the hyper-financialized system we have at the moment, where the most effective and rapid way of making money is more and more not actually making anything or providing any goods and services, but simply speculating on these asset prices. Those people made money for nothing, so why can't I? And those are the marks who lose their shirts when the price goes down, because you can bet your bottom dollar that all of the big fish are faster and have more access to capital to back up their positions. They don't have to rely on the same dodgy platforms for trading this stuff that the little fish do. If you're buying into this stuff, consider the possibility that you might end up being the greater fool for all the people who bought before you and who are selling onto you, and the necessity you now have to ensnare new fools after you to jack up the price even further. Does that sound Ponzi enough for you yet? And this is before we even get into the GameStop-type argument. That is to say, at this stage, enough of the major financial institutions are speculating on this stuff, investment banks and hedge funds and so on. They're betting on it and profiting from it too, so you're not striking a blow against them in buying it, because they can co-opt it into their system much more easily than it will replace their system. You're just enriching the people who already hold it, who are already, most likely, much wealthier than you. So, what do we finally have here? I just feel like there's not an awful lot here. It's not a reliable hedge against inflation. It's not a replacement currency. It's inefficient. Can't possibly do what currencies do today. It's already entailed a catastrophic increase in electricity consumption to do very little. It diverts finances away from things that might actually be productive. It's not a hedge against the apocalypse. The anarcho-libertarian fantasies where it is actually useful are unrealistic. Has very few actual legitimate uses. Other cryptocurrencies already exist that are more efficient and actually do some useful work perhaps, or can perform with better functionality. But unfortunately they're less recognised and therefore more subject to price manipulation and pump and dump schemes. And even in these cases, you can argue that the fundamental thing where you're losing this necessity to centrally trust an authority is not actually worth that much and may not even be that desirable to most of the people who want to use a currency. So when it comes down to it, you look at all the hype around it, you just think that this epitomises everything about the financialised false promises of overhyped so-called technology that I rail against in these Thermonuclear types episodes. It promises to be something revolutionary that changes the world in many respects and is finishing up as a tulip. And it produces this cynical noise factory around it, people adding the word blockchain to their startup to cash in on the hype. It actually happened in 2017 during the first wave of the hype, when a company called Long Island Iced added blockchain to its name and saw its shares spike by 300% overnight, even though it was just making iced tea. People pouring money into it until institutional investors and even pension funds are buying into this now. People spinning fantastical worlds or capitalising on perhaps righteous indignation about the way things are set up now, but diverting mental and literal energy into this cynical project, which is just ultimately hoping to profit from your hopes and dreams by pumping up yet another useless asset. We don't have time to be doing this. We don't have time to talk about this as if it's going to change and fix anything. And very few people are finding uses for the underlying technology of the blockchain anyway that can't be done in other ways that already exist, or where the blockchain doesn't ultimately add very little value aside from maybe that 300% boost to the stock price of your company based on people who are hyped about it. If you, the listener, can find genuine counterexamples to that I haven't addressed, please let me know. as I would be interested to hear about them. But even if I did hear about them, I still wouldn't think it would be a decent argument for investing in some of the stuff that's out there at the moment, particularly Bitcoin, because there was a dot-com bubble too. So this is like a dot-com bubble 2.0 in the sense that some obviously inferior technologies are being overhyped by people who are very cynically doing that. And perhaps in the long run, we will, once we've got past the inflated expectations peak, we'll find out some of the useful things that this stuff can actually be used for. I think it will ultimately end up being a lot more niche than the internet, which was obviously a lot more useful. A few years ago, people who used to held Bitcoin would try and lecture you if you criticised it, explaining how you're missing the genius of the underlying technology. But now their response is often just to enjoy being poor and keep crying about it. Keep crying salty tears because you didn't invest in this thing, as its price continues to increase. I actually prefer that. At least it's more honest, albeit a little distasteful to say, I bet that the line would go up and I was right this time, and just sort of bragging that you won in a sort of gambling or predict the trend game, I mean, we're getting to a point where being able to predict when the peak of hype surrounding something will be is an increasingly large fraction of what we reward people for in society, apparently. And this is, of course, precisely why so many Bitcoin enthusiasts have to be so irritating. They know that controlling the narrative and the sentiment is everything, because underneath the facade there's no substance. But you will forgive me if that's not what I would like our species to spend its time or money on, even if it makes some individuals wealthy, and I'm not going to speak glowingly of it, or recommend that people invest in it, or recommend that people spend that much time thinking about it if they can avoid it. And given its negative impacts on the climate, I think it's something that we should oppose when we talk about it. And given its negative impacts on society, in terms of the financial energy and assets that are being devoted to it, I think it's something we should oppose. I can't predict a crash in the value of it any more than anyone else can. We are reminded by Keynes, of course, that the market can stay irrational for longer than we can stay solvent. But I don't see any underlying value to Bitcoin, and not really blockchain either. And certainly Bitcoin's main value is brand recognition. Neither are there really any long-term use cases for Bitcoin particularly that make sense, aside from as this speculative asset that is just limited in supply. Maybe that will be enough. Maybe people will always believe in it as a store of value, even if its price fluctuates wildly, or sometimes for no apparent reason at all, and its legal status remains a concern. Maybe it will replace gold as just a thing that people buy because they all believe that it's worth something and agree on that. Although, of course, gold just has some use. Maybe it's just like the gods in Neil Gaiman's American Gods, who draw their power and strength from the collective belief of the humans who invented them. But, sometimes people who have accepted that this is not actually going to be a revolutionary thing and it's just a store of value, they'll come up with these strange arguments of like, well, it's only worth this because people are willing to buy it at this price, but how is that any different to a normal currency? The difference, of course, is that a fiat currency is backed by a government and all the apparatus of the state. You can be compelled to pay taxes in it. It's cheaper and easier to exchange. It's much better as a medium of exchange than Bitcoin, and it's accepted in way more places for an exchange for goods and services, so they're not that alike. It's true that people and investors speculate on the value of real currencies too, but they're clearly not as purely speculative an investment vehicle as Bitcoin is. And once you accept that speculation, just hoping that the demand won't collapse, then you must see why I personally wouldn't want to buy into it. And hey, I wish good luck to anyone who wants to try and cash out at the right moment. Congratulations to people who made money from it, from getting in early and getting out. If you're someone who wasn't that wealthy and who managed to make money this way, well done for getting it right. Honestly, I think part of the vitriol that floats around the subject is that Bitcoin and cryptocurrency fans spend a lot of time in online forums and on Reddit, and they're used to virtually every post they read having an ulterior motive. And since they are the ones trying to manipulate the price of Bitcoin to push it up, they also assume that if you say anything against it, even if your criticism is valid, even if it's something they don't want to address, they assume that you must be, as well, trying to manipulate the price when you criticise it. Maybe you're bitter that you missed out on making a fortune, perhaps you've bet against it in some way. But in all honesty, given the rampant Ponzi's all around the world, in some ways it's no worse than plenty of other ways people make money. And yeah, I like seeing the stories of someone who invested a few $100s in something a few years ago and then somehow became a millionaire. I'm not opposed to having lotteries like that exist, I suppose, in principle. But it's a bit like wishing luck to people in Vegas. But unlike wishing luck to people in Vegas, gamblers in Vegas, if they win, it's not the casino owners who ultimately lose, but ultimately I fear some of the greater fools that they sold their coins onto, not to mention the negative impacts we've talked about it having on the environment in terms of wasted electricity. If it's just going to be some big gambling speculative enterprise, why bolt it onto this weird libertarian crypto fantasy instead? And why bolt it onto this massive wasteful electricity project of cracking numbers instead? Why not just play the lottery? Why not just all agree to bid up the price of something that we all agree has no use, like GameStop? But seeing, institutional investors get in on this, I'm concerned that eventually, this thing could crash in value, and then it will drive a much wider crash. And when there are these much wider crashes, the people who have power and money and influence tend to find ways to defend themselves, and the people who don't have power and money and influence tend to be screwed over by them. We saw it in 2009, we're seeing it again now, and we could see it again if this asset bubble pops in these cryptocurrencies, which have no reason really to be worth what they're worth. And in that case, it would be driven once again, as all hyper-financialized crashes are, fundamentally by the greed of people who con themselves into thinking that they'd produce something too smart or too big to fail, or cynical enough to hope that they could all find a chair when the music finally stopped. But hey, maybe I'm wrong about all this. Obviously, I'm quite strident in my views. Quite often when debating with enthusiasts, they will insist that there's some magical or mystical aspect of the technology that you don't get, or fail to appreciate the value of. I just see smoke and mirrors in that. Well, as I say, I expect to get angry emails from at least a few of you off the back of this, so please, if you think I'm missing anything, if you think I'm being unfair, I've said I'm strident, I've said I'm fixed in my views, but don't judge me too harshly. Send your opinions, send your points of view, send the places where you disagree with me and your objections to this. And if there's anything good there, I will definitely try and respond to that in a future episode. Because, I'm open to having a more nuanced opinion on this than I do. But I would be surprised if there's anything that is really going to change my mind. But hey, take that as a challenge. If you're someone who's been listening and disagreeing, take that as a challenge. And this has been one of the longest and rambliest episodes that I've ever done, I think. I'm glad to have got it off my chest. I'm sure it will have bored the people who have listened. I'm quite happy to never ever talk about cryptocurrencies again, except, of course, if I respond to emails from people who are getting that. That will be some separate episode, but it's a topic I will be happy not to revisit in the future, outside of maybe one or two dedicated episodes to those responses, because, as I say, the discourse around it is just so polluted and so toxic and so irritating to engage in when there are much more important things that we could and should be engaged with. And yet it's so infuriating that it caused me to undergo this rant. But hey, it's cheaper than therapy. So thank you for listening to this episode. You can find us on the web at physicspodcast.com. There, any comments, questions or concerns, you can get in touch, particularly if you have a response to this episode. If you're a fan and you disagree with me, I'd like to hear that. You can find the full list of episodes we've done in the past there on the About section. You can also find the Patreon. You may be listening to this episode early on the Patreon if you're a real diehard dedicated fan, and you can subscribe to that. Thank you to everyone who has done that already. Of course, the best way to support the show is to tell other people who may be interested in it to listen to it, and you can send them to that About page now and let them see what their favourite episodes might be. The transcripts are also up there. There's plenty of other things to plug, but as you can hear, my voice is cracking with the emotion of having ranted for so long on this topic. So I'm going to take the rest of the evening off. Until next time then, please do, take care.